China's two sessions continue in Beijing as Premier Li delivers the 2020 government work report. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. This year's big political season in Beijing is now in full swing after being postponed for more than 2 months because of the coronavirus pandemic. China's National People's Congress convened on Friday at the Great Hall of the People. The big item on the agenda was the address of Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. He delivered the 2020 government work report and addressed major issues like poverty alleviation. We also learned more about China's economic plans.
I would like to point out that we have not set a specific target for economic growth this year. This is because our country will face some factors that are difficult to predict in its development due to the great uncertainty regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the world economic and trade environment.
Later in the show, our panel will give their perspective on Friday's developments, but we begin with Cheng Li. He is the Director and Senior Fellow of the China Center at the Brookings Institution. Cheng Li, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has said that China will not be setting a growth target for its economic growth for this year. He said that in his work report in Beijing. He cited uncertain economic factors as well as the uncertainty caused in the trade environment by the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that makes perfect sense to me, because it all depends on the situation of COVID-19, both domestically, whether it will be second wave, or internationally, because China's economic driving factors, whether it be export, consumption, and investment, all depend on this kind of situation. I think this is reasonable, and it's actually it's very rational in my view. Now, it's also interesting that this time that the Premier Li also did not mention that the military budget increase, although China's Ministry of Finance did release some number, actually 6.6%, lower than last year's 7.5%. Now, but this is also subjected to the international environment or the China's, external environment. Especially refer to the Taiwan Strait situation. So I think this is certainly caught attention, and it's quite different from the previous years.
We also heard a commitment from Premier Li that China will continue to open its door to the world. How important is that for China's ongoing development, especially at this time, when there's so much uncertainty and economies around the world taking such a heavy hit?
Well, again, China's development needs conducive international environment, whether because of what China wanted to have the resources, but also that China needs to export its own products. So again, China certainly probably more than any other country benefit from economic liberalization. And for China, economic liberalization is not a choice, but a necessity. But at the same time, China actually more and more leaning towards its own consumption, domestic consumption. So reliance on the international kind of factors actually reduced over the years. But nevertheless, China should be part of the international system. So also China learned that when you want to go out, you also want to welcome other foreign companies to China. You also need to provide a good business environment to the private sector, and especially for small size business, they are hit by coronavirus more than any other sectors. So I think this is a good way to put in the context. Also, I think this will reflect in China's policies. You do see some opening in the financial sector. You also know some of the new policies for foreign companies in terms of the negative list and many other things. I hope that in light of the coronavirus, I think more foreign companies also will evaluate the China market in a different light.
2020 will be a key year for China. That's the year the country has set to eliminate all poverty in the country and build a moderately prosperous society. Do you believe these goals can still be accomplished given that we now have the pandemic?
Well, actually, 3 years ago when China had the 19th Party Congress, they lay out the 3 objectives or 3 challenges. The number 1 is the financial risks and also the other risks, both domestically and internationally. Number 2 is environment degradation. China needs to address that issue seriously. And number 3 is what you just mentioned, the poverty elimination, not poverty reduction, but the poverty elimination. Now, this is certainly not started in the 19th Party Congress. It started with Deng Xiaoping's reform. You may even argue that it started earlier. But over the past 40 years, China has made tremendous progress in this area based on Bill Gates' calculation that over the past 40 years, a total of 800 million people got out of poverty based on the definition of poverty. Early on, it's like $1 per day, then later on $1.5 per day. So that's a remarkable number of people, 800 million. This is 10 times of population of entire Germany, the largest country in EU. Certainly that contributes to the reduction of poverty on the global scale along with India. So that's an important achievement, certainly make China look good in this area. As we also know, there's a lot of problems in today's world caused by economic disparity, certainly also include China. But in that regard, because of poverty reduction or poverty elimination, certainly reduced that tension. So it also provided the social political stability for the country. So this is another important factor, not only just for international perspective, but also domestic as well.
You know, with these 2 meetings taking place during the global pandemic and also at a time of great uncertainty around the world, what do you think is the overall message that China wants to send to the world from the 2 sessions meetings?
Well, first of all, that China still pay a lot of attention to coronavirus because it's still not over yet. So you found the Congress, on one hand, you do see kind of a rise of confidence because relatively speaking, especially after the first few weeks of delay, China come out very, very strongly and China largely contained that. You do see the rise of confidence by the delegates. But at the same time, China is not in the mood to celebrate because it's far too early. And also they only talk about this is the first phase of the fight against coronavirus. So there's no such a mood of triumphalism. And but on the other hand, China is determined to put the public health as the top priority. That actually is very, very important. You know, this is actually it's well received by the Chinese public. But it's still not over. And also there's a tremendous economic challenge for China. You know, looking back in February, particularly in the middle of February, when China had the confirmed cases about 75,000 and also 2,200 deaths at that time, the outside world, the reported cases only like the 1,100 and the only deaths is about 8 people. So put that perspective, China was, you know, at that time was severely, you know, hit by coronavirus. But after some of the important changes, the changes of policy and the changes of mobilization and etc. So China eventually come out strongly. Now, of course, it's still not over yet. This is a message that the leadership want to send to Chinese people and also send it to the international community as well. I think this is a right way to understand the challenge we face. There are a lot of things that we still do not know and about the coronavirus, and also that if outside world not recover, China will, you know, also will not be immune with this kind of challenge. So it's not so much of an isolation, lockdown. This is only the formality. The real things is really require international cooperation with treatment or vaccine development.
Cheng Li, I've just got about a minute left, but I want to get your opinion on the current relationship between China and the United States. What is your assessment of where things stand right now, and how big are the stakes as we see tensions continue to rise?
Well, unfortunately, U.S.-China relation is deteriorating very, very fast, faster than anyone can imagine. Just a few years ago, not just a few months ago. I think that you entered a spiral. It's out of control, partly related with domestic politics in both countries and the U.S. election per se, partly related with the impact of coronavirus early on China, and then now in the United States more severely. And you do see the anxiety, fear, panic, distrust, disbelief. But I think that the people should put things in the perspective that it's not the interest of China, neither China nor United States, to continue this kind of confrontational and the spiral situation will likely out of control. So we do need to continue to emphasize the shared interest, whether it be economic financial stability or fighting against the coronavirus.
Cheng Li, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and now for our panel. Joining me now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Also with us via Skype from Hong Kong is Iris Pang. She is Chief Economist for ING Greater China. And joining us too via Skype from Michigan is Doug Guthrie. He is Director of China Initiatives at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Welcome to all of you. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. As we heard, one of the headlines out of these two sessions meetings was the government report, which talked there about the fact that China will not be setting a growth target for this year. In fact, the Chinese news agency Xinhua said no government target is a good target. How do you see it?
Well, I think it is the Chinese government is being pragmatic, is being realistic. As the Premier said in his report, that there are too many uncertainties. If you set a specific target and you are less sure than previous years that the country is going to achieve that target. So because of the infection, inside China, outside China, so you are not sure what will happen next month, say in the U.S., in European countries, as well as inside China. So I think the country is looking at the next half of the year and being pragmatic, and also that does not mean they are not confident of the growth in a positive direction. I think the government is still looking at a positive growth like at 1-2% for next half of the year. That's not a target being talked about by the Premier, but most people believe yes, the economy will continue to grow, probably much slower than previous years.
You mentioned the infections, Qinduo Xu. What is the situation in China right now? Is the government confident that they've got this under control, although there are some clusters that we see in some places?
For the overall situation, I think the government is confident that it is under control for sure. Chinese people are also, in general, people understand the situation is safe. For example, in Beijing, more than 30 days, probably there's no new local infection. But occasionally, you do have, for example, previously in Wuhan, you have a couple of infections. And then in Shanghai, you have a single infection, or Guangzhou. And then mostly now situation is in northeastern part of China, the 3 provinces bordering Russia in particular. So quite a number of infections, mostly imported, we say, from Russia. Chinese people coming back to China, and then they got infected somehow. So there are some also local infection in one of the cities. So the city itself is also, again, like Wuhan, is being locked down in the lockdown mode. So it's very local, I would say. Overall, say the rest of the country is pretty safe.
Iris Pang, what is your assessment of China's economic approach as outlined in that work report, especially in this time of a lot of uncertainty?
I believe that the work report, the government work report, has addressed lots of issues, especially on job stability, which I believe is due to the global weak demand from COVID-19. As many of you has already pointed out, there are still many uncertainties out of China, and because of COVID-19, because of the social distancing measures, the demand there is still very weak. Look at the U.S. jobless claims and also the unemployment rates across U.S., UK, and Europe. So this will directly hit export orders of China and therefore job stability of factory workers. And therefore the government work report tries to address this issue this year.
All right, let's bring in Doug Guthrie from Michigan. Doug, Premier Li did commit to the country remaining open to the rest of the world. How important will that be for the global economy as countries around the world try to recover from this pandemic?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really important thing to just touch on a couple of things that my old friend Dr. Cheng Li talked about, which have to do with what Li Keqiang was addressing. So, of course, China is the manufacturing hub for the world, and China can't leave that. It's got to continue to be that, and it's got to continue to develop and be open for the dramatic evolution of the supply chain that exists there. That being said, I'm less concerned about the growth of China's economy than some people are, because China's economy is still in this transition from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth, which Cheng Li mentioned. And so, you know, China's government can continue to put its hand on the scale of like how to continue to develop the economy through investment in infrastructure. And so they'll do that. That being said, they have to continue to be open as the manufacturing hub for the world. They can't lose that position that has been sort of just such a powerhouse of their growth over the last 30 years. So they've got to be open, but it's a hard situation. And in particular, it's difficult because of the floating population. One of the things that is one of the secret sauces of China's development and China's manufacturing economy is the fact that there's 270 million people that in effect float around the economy and are sort of the manufacturing migrant laborers of the entire system. And if you can't have people moving around the economy, that system sort of falls apart. One of the things about having people move around the economy is, you know, if you're trying to lock down cities, that becomes a conundrum. And so the interesting thing for me is really figuring out how the floating population and the manufacturing economy all work together. Investment-led growth can continue, but it's gonna be a really interesting thing seeing how the manufacturing economy continues.
Doug, just one point there where you say that China will remain the manufacturing hub. How does that meet the challenge of reduced foreign demand?
Well, so to me, this is an interesting thing. You know, whether it's Donald Trump or Peter Navarro or anyone else who sort of thinks about this, they think that you can just impose tariffs and people can move manufacturing around the world. The thing that's interesting about China's manufacturing economy is it's really the most complete, in my opinion, it's really the most complete manufacturing economy of any economy in the world. So you have these three key elements that are really crucial. You have a massive migrant labor force, 270 million people that float around the country and are migrant laborers. You also have a very, very intensive vocational technical labor force that is bigger than any other country except maybe India. And you have an integrated infrastructure system that exists like nowhere in the world. And so it's hard for me to imagine, you know, when I think about the companies that I've advised over the years, it's hard for me to imagine how they would find that kind of system anywhere else. And so the thing is sitting there, but China has to make sure that they don't shut it down. And, you know, that's an interesting question right now.
Qinduo Xu, the government report also emphasized the importance of employment, of creating jobs, and there is a plan to create more than 9 million jobs this year. Will China be able to achieve that?
It's a tough challenge. That's why, you know, the government is not setting a specific target for economic growth. So for the priority for the government is really about the employment situation, you know, creating more jobs. and also is about the poverty alleviation. Speak of creating more jobs, I think the Chinese government is trying to play a more active role in helping create the jobs, not only relying on the market, but also the government is taking the situation in its hand to a certain degree, let's say. For example, the Education Ministry is launching this 100-day national campaign from May to August, together with 12,000 Chinese companies, local companies, and other agencies. So they are going to create 1 million jobs. So far, already half of that have been, half of the students already got the offer. And then at the same time, they are trying to reduce the pressure on the job market. For example, they are expanding the postgraduate program to basically to offer extra 190,000 positions for the students to continue their study for another 2 years to get a master's degree. And also similarly, like a top-up program. If you are in the 2-year college, you are encouraged to continue for another 2 years to get a bachelor's degree.
Right.
And primary, secondary, so kindergartens are also expanding their hiring by 300,000, more hiring than last year. So these kind of schemes will play a role.
Iris Pang, of course, China has been a major force in driving the global economy over the last few years, the last several years. Do you think the economic plans, as outlined in that report, will get a positive response from the world?
There is one point that could hit the nerve of the U.S., that is advancing technology in Premier Li's work report. But aside from that, the advanced technology plan has been there in China for many years. And I don't think that China is going to give up this position or going to grow in this area, because this is the future of the Chinese economy, and it's very important now this year to create jobs, to induce consumption and investments, and to further create more jobs out of the technology sector. So in terms of international perspective, I think China needs to really talk to maybe US and Europe on this front. But I believe that it will be difficult and challenging, because it seems to me that even during COVID, US is still trying to trigger a technology tension with China. And because I believe that is because this year is a US election year. And apart from that, because US actually don't want to have China being competitive in the technology area. I think there is a challenge for China, but at this time, challenge also means risk, also means opportunities.
Right.
So this means that China will continue to invest a lot in advanced technology.
Doug, when we were talking to Cheng Li there, and I asked him about relations between the United States and China, he said things are bad. The situation is very dire. The countries have already signed a trade deal, or phase 1 of the trade deal. Do you think that trade deal is in any kind of jeopardy?
I don't think the specifics of that trade deal are in jeopardy. What I think is in jeopardy is the overall relationship. And so I agree with Cheng Li that things are weak right now. The thing that I would say, and I would just caution people in the United States to think about this, I think we think because we're the largest economy in the world that we have the upper hand in this. I don't think that there's any way that we win a trade war with China, and I think that China is actually on a different path. I think that, Cheng Li mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative and some other things that are going on where China is really moving aggressively on developing other parts of the world. And, I'm fundamentally an engagement guy. Like, I believe that engagement is better than detente. And so I think we should all be working together. I just don't think that trade the trade deal issues are going to affect China that much. I think they're going to have an impact, but I think they're going to hurt the U.S. more than they're going to hurt China.
And I'm wondering, Doug, how much of it is posturing, because there actually are talks still going on between, at a very senior level, on the trade talks.
Absolutely, and I just wish people would just, I think everybody would be best advised to just like kind of be nice to each other and think that we're working towards engagement, because these two countries, the two largest economies in the world, we need to be partners. There's just no two ways about it.
Qinduo Xu, before we go, let's talk a little about Hong Kong and how that's being addressed at two sessions. What can you tell us about this draft decision on national security legislation for Hong Kong?
Well, I think this is a response from the central government, basically, to the recent development in Hong Kong. The situation in particular last year, almost a year ago, starting from June, the demonstration protest then became more violent, rioting, trampling of the national flag, storming into the legislature building, etc. So the image obviously is very negative. And remember, under this basic law, people call it like a mini constitution for Hong Kong. Article 23 is about national security. So Hong Kong was authorized to make laws to implement that national security. It tried back in 2003. It failed, and then no government in Hong Kong has ever tried again. 23, many years have passed. So the security situation, in a sense, somehow became more urgent, becoming an emergency issue, and partly because of the relationship between China and the U.S. is getting more deteriorating, let's say. So you do see, from Beijing's point of view, you do see the sign, you do see the shadow, of U.S. involvement, right, or some organizations' involvement supporting those demonstrations. So there's a urgent sense, the Beijing need to do something. Okay. If Hong Kong can't do it, yes, the National People's Congress will do it.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. That's all for this edition of The Heat. Thanks to everybody on the panel. I'm Arnold Naidu. Thanks for watching.